How do insects deal with all these nasty chemicals and defenses that plants throw at them? Just like plants, which are subjected to the negative effects of insects feeding on them and therefore have a lot of selective pressure that could benefit the evolution of traits that allow them to resist and deal with herbivores, insects face the same challenge. What are they going to do when they encounter a host plant that has all these nasty things in them? What's the opposite of plant defense? Well, it's herbivore offense. This very nice paper here by Rick Carbon and Anurag Agrawal really outline the essence of these interactions between plants and herbivores. It's not just plants defending themselves against herbivory, but it's also herbivores having to overcome those defensive traits. So that's what we're going to talk about in this particular lecture. How do insects actually deal with this? Well, it's easy to just categorize these into three different modes. One is pre-ingestive mechanisms. That is, what can insects do before those chemicals even get into their bodies? The second is ingestive mechanisms. Once the plant material has been taken in, what are the biochemical and physiological mechanisms that insects have to actually prevent them from actually getting into the body? And the final is, the last one is post-ingestive mechanisms. It's gotten into the body of the insect. What are the biochemical and physiological ways in which insects can prevent damage from actually happening? So let's start with the first one there, pre-ingestive mechanisms. Basically, this has to do with ways in which insects can deal with the structure of plants and access that plant material or prevent chemicals from getting into the body. So here's an example of a plant defense, the use of the existence of trichomes, of hairy plant structures that we talked about earlier, or leaf toughness or things like that. There are some caterpillars, for example, such as this one here, that actually have very sclerotized prolegs that allow them to basically have an armor so that they don't get damaged by these hooks. So having a hard external outer shell, unlike the soft-bodied aphids, is a way in which these insects can actually access these plants that otherwise could be quite damaging to them. Another way is that certain caterpillars, we talked about plant toughness as a potential deterrent or defense mechanism. Well, how do you overcome plant toughness? You just plow right through it. There are certain caterpillars here of skipper butterflies that have these enormous heads, and inside of these enormous heads are very strong muscles that allow basically the mandibles to rip through all kinds of really tough tissues such as grasses or other things that are rich in silica, which we've already described as having a really strong impact on the ability for insects to even break in through that tissue. Another way is to just remove some of those physical barriers that might exist, such as the trichomes. Here, for example, is what it looks like when a particular, these are monarch caterpillars that have actually gone through and mowed down all of the trichomes on a milkweed plant, so that all you see here are the little stubs of the trichomes remaining, and here they're still intact. Once that layer has actually been removed, literally shaved off or mowed off, then they can access the leaf tissue without the spines getting into their mandibles. Here's a simple little experiment that was done here with these leaf beetles, where they looked at different instars of beetles, different stages, either early on or all the way up to adults, and they literally shaved the hairs off of their particular host plants that they normally would feed on. And then they looked at what kind of plants that they actually preferred, the ones that were shaved or the ones that were not shaved. And you can see here that especially for the younger instars, which generally would struggle to get into those plant tissues, they have an increase in preference for those plants from which those trichomes have actually been taken off compared to the later instars or the adults. Here's another pre-ingestive way in which some herbivores can reduce the potential damage that plants have on them. We learned earlier that there's a certain class of compounds, the linear phyranocoumarins, that in the presence of UV light are photoactive and cross-link DNA, causing cell replication and other things to become damaged. Well, if you can prevent UV light from actually hitting the leaves as you're feeding on them, this could minimize that kind of damage. And in fact, there are some caterpillars, like this one here, that produce leaf rolls like this. They will actually use a little bit of silk to roll up the leaf, and then they feed from the inside of the leaves of these plants, like St. John's wort, that contain these linear phoranocoumarins, therefore preventing that photo activation to actually happen. Another way in which plants can prevent insects from actually getting at them is, in the first place, is to basically immobilize or otherwise gum up the mouth parts of insects through the secretion of either latexes or resins that are maintained in canals in the vascular tissue of the plant. And as soon as the insects bite on the leaf, these compounds are basically shot out. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. If you take a milkweed plant and you just kind of snap it, you immediately see these little beads of this white substance kind of pooling up like this. Now, this substance is not only sticky, but it's also full of cardinalides, which are toxic, especially for non-specialized insects, but even for specialized ones. Here you can see what happens when one of these veins was cut, and here is even a tiny little monarch caterpillar, which presumably are able to deal with these chemicals. But if a lot of them come out and they coat the insect or they get into the mouth parts, the smaller ones might be still susceptible to those. And so there are some insects that have actually developed ways of circumventing these latex defenses, basically by deactivating these pressurized canals, either by cutting the veins, by trenching leaves, or by overall kind of mass attacking a plant. This is particularly true with trees and bark beetles, so that they just can't produce enough pressure for the resins to actually come out. So let's take a look at some of these examples. Here, by the way, is an example of different kinds of vein structures that certain plants have. This is kind of a classic ramifying, branching architecture of the vascular system, where there's kind of a main vein, and then there's these lateral veins, and from these there's kind of sub branches that come off of that. In comparison, there are other plants that actually have kind of a reticulate system of veins that look more like this. This is called anastomizing versus ramifying. And insects have different ways of dealing with these different kinds of leaf vein architectures when they have these compounds in them. This is a great review paper by David Desseur, where here's an example of monarch caterpillars. Actually, this is a different Danaeus species that clip the leaves at the midrib here, and then they feed on the distal part of the plant, where the tissues can't get that pressurized leaf resin to get there. There are there's grasshoppers here that are doing the same things by clipping the veins and then feeding on the distal parts. They can avoid that as well. Here's a milkweed beetle doing the same, and so on. Very common. Another way for the anastomizing leaf vein structure is, since you can't just clip one vein because the resins and the latexes are maintained throughout the leaves, what these caterpillars and these herbivores have to do is actually create a trench that goes across the entire system. And once they've done that, as you can see here, then they can feed on the distal portions without the pressure of those resins and latexes actually getting there. Here's another example of a leaf trench, and then feeding on the distal portions as well. And there's all kinds of clever ways in which insects do this. Here you can again see another example of a monarch caterpillar that's been able to clip these veins and then feeding where they can't actually occur. Here's a circular trench here. And what you will find is that the deactivation of these canals actually does, in fact, reduce the exposure of the caterpillars to these compounds, to these latexes. And when you clip the veins compared to when you keep the veins intact versus when you clip them, and then you put different kinds of herbivore species on them, you can see that when the veins have been severed, there's a significant decrease in the exudate that can reach them and therefore affect them. And there's some insects that are just better at stealthily eating the plants, so that they will induce a smaller production of lower production of those latexes.